Pakled learned the hard way. You do not fuck with humanity. When the arrogant Pakled murdered hundreds of innocent humans in a surprise attack on Frontier Station, it was the greatest mistake they would ever make. The dead humans' blood was still floating in the vacuum of space when the first Terran battle fleets began assembling. In 2453, Paul Carter thought he was humanity's best hope for peace. The young diplomat had been hand-picked as the first human ambassador to the newly contacted Pakled Imperium. The Pakled were an advanced civilization, masters of the Gamma sector, with technology rumored to be centuries ahead of humanity's. Paul's mission was critical: establish friendly relations and negotiate trade deals to bring human space the Pakled's miraculous tech. But Paul had no idea what he was walking into. The Pakled were not interested in friendship. As an ancient species, they were obsessed with complex rituals, social hierarchies, and archaic rules. Thanks to a rushed diplomatic briefing, Paul was ignorant of their cultural nuances. When he arrived on the Pakled throne world for his first audience with their High Council, he accidentally botched the traditional greeting ceremony, a bewildering ritual involving sacred gestures, chants, and offerings that had to be performed perfectly to avoid grave offense. The Pakled were outraged. They considered the rituals absolutely sacrosanct and would not tolerate such disrespect, especially from a young upstart race. Paul tried desperately to apologize and explain that it was an honest mistake, but the Pakled counselors refused to listen. They were too proud and rigid to accept that humans were still learning their ways. To them, Paul's faux pas was an unforgivable insult, one that proved humanity's insolence. The honor-bound Pakled High Council voted to punish the disrespectful humans and teach them the consequences of angering their betters. The news of the surprise attack on Frontier Station spread through human space like wildfire. The outrage and grief were unfathomable. But once humanity learned the reason behind it, the Pakled's petty quest for retribution over an innocent diplomatic mistake, the fury of the human race knew no bounds. The Terran fleets were fully mobilized within hours. Across human space, warships were fueled, troops were armed, and the mightiest weapons were primed. The best warriors from every world, the hardest veterans from the toughest human colonies, were called to the battle. The Pakled were about to learn the terrible consequences of their arrogant attack. For the murder of a few hundred humans, the Pakled were about to lose everything. An empire that took 1,000 years to build would be reduced to ash and cinders in mere months under the onslaught of the Terran extermination fleets. The greatest mistake the galaxy ever made was to underestimate the deceptively fractious and divided humans. Because when their people were attacked, when innocent human blood was spilled, every last human in the galaxy would unite with a singular purpose: to wipe out those responsible, to avenge their dead, to teach every alien race the meaning of fear. The Pakled would become the example, the ones talked about for centuries in fear by 100 alien civilizations. The ones who poked the sleeping giant of humanity's wrath and were destroyed so utterly for it that not even their cities or infrastructure would be left when the human fleets were done. The Pakled had earned that. Paul could only hope that this terrible lesson would be enough to deter the next alien race from repeating their foolish mistake. No one fucks with humanity and lives to tell of it. The Pakled were about to find that out, the hard way. As the Terran fleets unleashed hell across Pakled space, Paul Carter found himself recalled from the front lines by the human leadership. They had a new mission for him, one that could end the war once and for all. Paul sat in the briefing room, his uniform still stained with the blood and grime of battle. The generals laid it out for him: infiltrate the Pakled homeworld, assassinate Emperor Orion, the supreme leader who had ordered the cowardly attack on Frontier Station. Cut off the head of the snake and the body would die. Paul's stomach churned at the thought. He was a diplomat, not a killer. But as he looked around at the hardened faces of the generals, he knew they were right. This was the only way to end the slaughter quickly, to save countless lives on both sides. With a heavy heart, he accepted the mission. Infiltrating the Pakled capital would be a suicide mission. But Paul had a few tricks up his sleeve. His first stop was to Zorn, a black market arms dealer he knew from his diplomat days. Zorn grinned as Paul laid out his request. I've been waiting for you to come around, Carter. Let's get you suited up. Next, Paul needed a team, an infiltration squad of the best humanity had to offer. His first pick was Mac, a grizzled veteran of a dozen campaigns. The man had more battle scars than most had freckles. Then there was Jax, a hacker savant who could slice through any security system without difficulty. Finally, Riker, a master of disguise who could blend in anywhere. Together, they slipped into Pac-led space on stolen ships with forged IDs. Posing as a diplomatic envoy from a neutral species, they touched down on the Pac-led homeworld. Paul's skin crawled as he stepped out into the alien air. Somewhere in the towering spires ahead, Orion was waiting. Jax went to work, his fingers flying over the console as he hacked the planetary security network. One by one, the alarms and cameras winked out. "We're ghosts now," Jax said with a grin. Riker worked his magic next, disguising them in the robes and masks of Pac-led religious pilgrims. Hidden in plain sight, they slipped into the Imperial Palace. The opulence was staggering, all gleaming metal and priceless artifacts. Paul felt his rage build with every step. All this wealth, and for what? To fuel Orion's ego? And then it all went to hell. Shouts echoed from the corridor ahead. The clank of armor, the hum of energy weapons, Orion's personal guard. "Go!" Mac roared, shoving Paul forward. "I'll hold them off." Mac charged to meet the guards, his rifle spitting fire. Paul and the others raced onward, the sounds of battle fading behind them. They burst into the throne room, weapons drawn. And there he was, Emperor Orion, resplendent in his golden robes. But he wasn't alone. A phalanx of elite warriors stood between them and their target. "You!" Orion snarled, recognizing Paul. "The fool who doomed his own people." Paul seethed, his grip tightening on his rifle. Around him, his team fanned out, ready for battle. "It's over, Orion," Paul growled. "Your reign ends today." The Emperor laughed, a cruel mocking sound. He gestured to his warriors. "Kill them!" And with that, the throne room erupted into chaos. Energy beams crisscrossed the air, the sizzle of blade against blade. Paul lost sight of his team as he waded into the fray, cutting down warriors left and right. And then he was face to face with Orion himself. The Emperor had a blade in hand, his eyes alight with madness. "How many humans died because of your mistake, Carter?" he hissed. "How much blood is on your hands?" Paul roared, lunging at Orion. They clashed in the center of the melee, blade against blade, two leaders locked in a deadly duel. Around them, Paul's team fought desperately against the last of the guards. Orion was skilled, his blade a blur. But Paul was driven by something greater, the need for redemption, the faces of every human who had died in this war. With a final desperate strike, he buried his blade in Orion's chest. The Emperor fell with a gurgle, the light fading from his eyes. It was over. Orion was dead, but the fight wasn't done. Alarms were blaring. The Pac-led forces had been alerted. They swarmed towards the palace. Paul's team was battered and bloody, barely standing, but they had to escape, had to bring news of Orion's death to the fleet. It was time for a fighting retreat, time to blast their way out and spread the word that humanity's vengeance had been served. Paul's lungs burned as he sprinted through the winding streets of the Pac-led capital. The acrid stench of smoke and plasma discharge filled the air. Blaster bolts sizzled past, scorching the ornate buildings. "Contact left!" Jax shouted, unleashing a barrage from his rifle. Paul dove behind a fallen statue, chunks of stone exploding around him, as enemy fire rained down. He popped up, squeezing off precise shots. Two Pac-led soldiers dropped. "We're cut off from the north approach," Riker called out, his voice strained. "New route?" "This way," Paul growled, gesturing down a narrow alley. They ran, boots pounding on the metallic streets. Paul's mind raced. The spaceport was close, but Pac-led reinforcements poured in from all sides. A thunderous boom shook the ground. Paul's blood ran cold as a massive war machine stomped into view, blocking their path. Its armor gleamed in the harsh light, weapon ports overflowing. Shit, Jax breathed. We'll never get past that thing. Mac stepped forward, his weathered face set with persistence. I'll draw its fire. You lot get to the ship. Mac, no, Paul started, but the grizzled veteran was already moving. Been a pleasure serving with you boys, Mac said with a crooked grin. Then he charged, unleashing a primal war cry. The walker's guns swiveled, energy beams lancing out. Mac dodged and weaved, returning fire. His shots barely scorched the walker's armor, but he kept moving, keeping its attention. Go! Paul roared, shoving Jax and Riker forward. They sprinted for the spaceport, the sounds of Mac's last stand fading behind them. Paul's throat tightened, but he pushed the grief down. There'd be time to mourn later. They reached the ship, scrambling up the ramp. Jax's fingers flew over the console, bypassing security protocols. Riker slid into the pilot's seat. Hurry! Paul snapped, manning the rear guns. Pakled troops swarmed the landing pad. With a lurch, the ship lifted off. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around them. The hull shuddered under the impacts. Hang on, Riker shouted. He gunned the engines, corkscrewing through the barrage. G-forces slammed Paul back in his seat as they punched through the atmosphere. They'd made it. But the cost? As they raced for human space, Paul composed the encrypted message to High Command. His fingers trembled slightly as he typed. Mission accomplished. Emperor Orion eliminated, awaiting further orders. He hit send, exhaling slowly. It was done. Now to see if it was enough to turn the tide. Days passed in a blur of tactical updates and strategic planning. The human fleet surged forward, hammering Pakled positions all along the front. But even as victory seemed within reach, reports flooded in of Pakled atrocities. Colonies burning, civilians massacred. The Pakled were lashing out in desperation, resorting to ever more brutal tactics. Then came the transmission that chilled Paul to his core. A Pakled general sneering into the camera, boasting of a superweapon that could annihilate entire worlds. An ultimatum: surrender, or watch human planets burn. Paul found himself in another briefing room, staring at holographic projections of a distant asteroid base. A suicide mission, but what choice did they have? He looked at Jax and Riker, his last remaining teammates. They nodded grimly, ready to follow him into hell one last time. As they prepped for the mission, faces flashed through Paul's mind. Mac's cocky grin. The countless soldiers who died under his command. The civilians caught in the crossfire of this bloody war. He pushed the memories aside, focusing on the task ahead. One final push. One last chance to end this. All right, team, Paul said, his voice steady. Let's finish this. Paul, Jax, and Riker's stolen Pakled ship glided silently through the asteroid field. Chunks of rock drifted past the view screen as Riker expertly piloted them towards their target. There, Paul said, pointing to a metallic structure jutting from a massive asteroid. That's gotta be it. They docked undetected and slipped inside. The corridors were eerily quiet as they crept through the base. Suddenly alarms blared. Pakled troops poured in from all directions, led by a towering figure in ornate armor. General Xandar, Paul growled. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air. Paul dove behind a console as Riker's sniper rifle cracked. Pakled soldiers dropped, but more kept coming. Jax, find that weapon! Paul shouted over the din. Jax's fingers flew across his datapad. Working on it! Paul popped up, squeezing off shots. A bolt grazed his shoulder and he hissed in pain. Got it, Jax yelled. Control room's 3 levels down. A scream of agony pierced the air. Paul turned to see Riker slumped against the wall, blood pooling beneath him. Riker! Paul scrambled to his friend's side. Riker gripped Paul's arm, his breathing ragged. Finish it, Paul. Don't let them win. With a final, shuddering breath, Riker went still. Paul's vision blurred with tears, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let Riker's sacrifice be in vain. Let's move, he growled to Jax. They fought their way through the base, leaving a trail of Pakled corpses in their wake. Paul's rage fueled him, driving him forward. Finally, they reached the control room doors. Paul planted charges and stepped back. The explosion rocked the corridor. As the smoke cleared, Paul saw General Xandar flanked by his elite guard. The Pakled sneered. "You're too late, human. The weapon is already armed. Your homeworld burns in minutes." "Like hell," Paul snarled. He hurled himself at the guards. His combat knife flashed as he slashed and stabbed. One by one, the Pakled warriors fell. Xandar drew his own blade. The two leaders clashed, trading vicious blows. Paul felt his strength fading but refused to give in. With a roar, he knocked Xandar's weapon aside and drove his knife into the Pakled's throat. Xandar gurgled, eyes wide with disbelief. "It doesn't matter," the general choked out. "You can't stop it now." Paul staggered to the main console. Warning lights flashed as the countdown ticked away. He smacked his fists against the controls, but nothing happened. With no other choice, Paul threw himself bodily at the terminal. Sparks flew as he smashed through circuitry and wiring. Alarms shrieked as systems overloaded. Paul collapsed to the floor, his vision fading. The last thing he saw was the countdown freezing with just seconds to spare. Paul's eyes snapped open. The harsh glare of medical bay lights assaulted his vision. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog from his mind. "Easy there, hero," a familiar voice said. Jack stood over him, a rare smile on his face. "You've been out for 3 days." Paul tried to sit up, but his body protested. Every muscle ached. "The weapon?" "Destroyed," Jax confirmed, "along with Xandar and that entire base. You did it, Paul." Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. A uniformed officer strode into the room, her face grim. "Commander Carter, we need you back in action," she said without preamble. "Intel just uncovered something big. The Pakled have been developing a bioweapon. If deployed, it could wipe out humanity in weeks." Paul's stomach churned. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. "Where?" "Remote planet called Kalara. We're sending in a strike team. You and Jax will lead." Hours later, their stealth shuttle touched down on Kalara's rocky surface. Paul's joints creaked as he moved, but adrenaline dulled the pain. They approached the facility under cover of darkness. Jax's fingers danced over his holopad, bypassing security protocols. The massive blast doors slid open with a soft hiss. Inside, the air felt heavy, oppressive. They moved silently through sterile corridors, passing rows of sealed containment units. Paul's skin crawled at the thought of what lurked inside. They reached a central hub. Holographic displays flickered to life, revealing terrifying data. Gene sequences, viral structures, projected casualty rates in the billions. "My God," Jax whispered. "We can't let this get out." Paul nodded grimly. "We need to wipe everything. Set charges on the containment units. I'll rig the reactor to overload." They worked quickly, planting explosives and hacking systems. Just as Paul finished the reactor sequence, alarms blared. "We've been made!" Jax shouted. The facility rumbled as the reactor surged. Electromagnetic energy crackled through the air, frying circuitry. Containment units hissed as their contents were neutralized. But as the dust settled, Paul realized their predicament. The blast had collapsed their exit tunnel. "This way," he growled, leading Jax down a maintenance shaft. They crawled through cramped ducts, the air growing thin. Paul's lungs burned as they emerged into a vast underground cavern. What he saw made his blood run cold. Hundreds of sleek alien drones filled the space. Unlike anything human or Pakled, their weapon ports bristled with unfamiliar tech. "They were going to load these with the bioweapon," Jax said, his voice hushed. "Send them against our worlds." Paul's mind raced. "Can you access their command systems?" Jax nodded, already working. "Give me 2 minutes." Suddenly, automated turrets sprang to life. Energy bolts sizzled past them as Paul returned fire. "Done!" Jax shouted. "I've redirected their targeting. They'll destroy this whole complex." The drones hummed to life, weapons priming. Paul grabbed Jax and sprinted for the nearest one. "What are you doing?" Jax yelled as Paul shoved him into the cockpit. "Getting us out of here." Paul's hands flew over unfamiliar controls. The drone lifted off just as the others opened fire. The cavern erupted in flames and chaos. They rocketed upward, the drone's weapons carving a path through solid rock. G-forces slammed Paul back as they burst into open air. As they flew away from the inferno below, Paul allowed himself a small smile. Another Pakled threat eliminated, but he knew the war was far from finished. Paul's eyes widened as the intel briefing flashed across the holo display. Ravagers, he muttered, studying the genetic schematics of the Pakled super soldiers. Jax leaned in, his face grim. They've been busy while we cleaned up their bioweapon mess. The mission parameters scrolled by. Credo 5, Industrial Hellscape, Ravager Stronghold. Paul's teeth gritted as he absorbed the details. Hours later, their dropship shuddered under the barrage of orbital fire. Paul gripped the harness, feeling the G-forces as they plummeted through Credo 5's atmosphere. 30 seconds, the pilot shouted. Paul checked his gear one last time. Heavy plasma rifle, demo charges, and a prototype shield generator. He'd need every advantage against these gene-enhanced monsters. The dropship's bay doors slammed open. Paul's boots hit scorched earth as he charged forward, dodging energy blasts from the facility's remaining defenses. Push to the main entrance, he bellowed over the comm. His team surged ahead, breaching charges detonating in controlled explosions. As the dust settled, Paul's blood ran cold. A Ravager stood in the corridor, easily 8 feet tall, its muscles rippling beneath scarred hide. It roared, spittle flying from its tusked maw. Open fire, Paul screamed. Their weapons blazed, but the Ravager shrugged off shots that would have shredded a normal Pakled. It barreled forward, swatting aside 2 soldiers like rag dolls. Paul hefted a plasma grenade, priming it. Eat this, you freak. The explosion rocked the hallway. When the smoke cleared, the Ravager lay in pieces. Jesus, Jax breathed. How many more of these things are there? They pressed on, fighting through twisting corridors. More Ravagers came, each deadlier than the last. Paul watched in horror as one regenerated a severed limb in seconds. His team dwindled. Good soldiers fell to rending claws and inhuman strength. By the time they reached the central lab, Paul could count his remaining troops on one hand. We're outnumbered, Jax said, his voice tight with pain from a nasty gash across his chest. There's too many. Paul's comm crackled. Carter, this is HQ. Reinforcements inbound with special payload. Hold position. Moments later, a sleek missile streaked through a breach in the ceiling. Paul's eyes widened as he recognized the nanotech warhead. Everyone, shields up, he roared. The warhead detonated, releasing a swarm of microscopic machines. Paul watched in fascination and revulsion as the Ravager's enhancement began to unravel. Howls of agony filled the air. Ravagers collapsed, their bodies twisting and deforming as the nanites rewrote their genetic code. Some turned on each other in maddened frenzy, tearing at mutating flesh with broken claws. When it was over, Paul surveyed the carnage. His stomach churned at the nightmarish scene of half-transformed corpses. It's done, he said quietly. Let's get the hell out of here. As they trudged back to the extraction point, Paul's mind raced. The Pakled threat was finished. But at what cost? He couldn't shake the feeling that this victory might have lasting consequences for both sides. The acrid stench of ozone filled Paul's nostrils as he staggered through the corridors of the Arcos facility. Alarms blared, their shrill cries echoing off cold metal walls. His team scrambled behind him, faces etched with exhaustion and terror. Move! Paul shouted, his voice hoarse. We've got minutes before this whole place collapses. They sprinted past flickering holograms and sparking consoles. The floor trembled beneath their feet as the reactor's meltdown accelerated. Jack stumbled, clutching his side where a Ravager's claw had torn through his armor. Paul grabbed his arm, hauling him forward. Don't you dare quit on me now, Paul growled. A massive tremor rocked the facility. Chunks of ceiling crashed down around them. Paul's mind raced, recalling the schematics they'd studied before the mission. Left, he barked. Hangar bay should be through here. They rounded the corner and found themselves face to face with a squad of automated sentries. Red targeting lasers danced across Paul's chest. Down! Paul dove as plasma bolts sizzled overhead. He rolled to his feet, drawing his sidearm in one fluid motion. 2 quick shots dropped the nearest robots. The rest of the team opened fire, filling the air with a storm of energy blasts. Circuits fried and metal screeched as the sentries fell. Clear! Jax shouted. They sprinted past the smoking wreckage. Paul's lungs burned as he gulped down the thin, poisoned air. His muscles screamed in protest, pushed far beyond human limits. The hangar doors loomed ahead, sealed tight. Paul smacked his palm against the access panel. Nothing. Damn it, he snarled. Jax, can you... Before he could finish, the facility rocked with its most violent quake yet. A deafening roar filled the air as reality itself seemed to buckle. Paul turned, his eyes widening in horror. A writhing mass of dark energy surged towards them, consuming everything in its path. The singularity had broken free. Brace yourselves! Paul screamed. The wave of entropic force slammed into them. Paul felt his atoms stretching, threatening to tear apart. His vision swam with impossible colors as the laws of physics broke down around him. Through sheer force of will, Paul held himself together. He reached out, grabbing Jax and another soldier as the void tried to pull them apart. With a sound like the universe tearing in half, the hangar doors ripped free of their moorings. Paul and his team were sucked out into the toxic atmosphere of Arcos. They tumbled through poisonous clouds, struggling to right themselves. Paul's suit computer shrieked warnings about radiation levels and atmospheric toxins. There! Jax shouted over the comm. Transport! Their shuttle hung in the sky above, a lifeline amidst the chaos. Paul activated his suit's thrusters, fighting against the raging winds. Behind them, the Pakled facility imploded. A sphere of absolute darkness expanded outwards, swallowing the twisted monuments to Pakled ambition. Paul dragged himself into the shuttle's airlock, collapsing to the deck. As the doors sealed shut, he caught one last glimpse of Arcos. The moon cracked like an egg, torn apart by forces beyond mortal comprehension. His vision faded as the shuttle rocketed away from the doomed world. Paul's last thought before unconsciousness took him was a prayer that the nightmare was finally over. Paul's eyes snapped open. The icy grip of cryostasis faded as warmth flooded back into his limbs. He gasped, lungs burning as they remembered how to breathe. The medbay's stark white ceiling swam into focus above him. Easy there, Commander, a familiar voice said. Jax's face appeared, relief etched across his features. You've been out for weeks. Paul tried to sit up, but his body refused to cooperate. Every muscle screamed in protest. He felt the phantom pain of decompression, the memory of his life force being sucked into the void. Vracus? Paul croaked, his throat raw. Dead, Jax confirmed, along with his entire command structure. The Pakled threat is finished. Paul closed his eyes, letting the enormity of it sink in. After years of bloodshed and sacrifice, it was finally over. But at what cost? He opened his eyes again, taking in the medbay. It wasn't the sterile environment he expected. The walls were scorched, equipment jury-rigged. Where are we? Jax's expression tightened. We're on Outpost Zeta. It's one of the few that survived Vracus's terror campaign. Paul's stomach churned as the memories flooded back. The intercepted transmission, the brutal attacks on civilian targets. He saw flashes of destroyed hospitals, shattered habitats. How bad, he asked, dreading the answer. Jax didn't sugarcoat it. We lost New Sydney, Proxima Station, and half a dozen smaller outposts. Millions dead or displaced. Paul's fists clenched, rage building despite his exhaustion. It wasn't enough for them to lose. They had to take as many of us with them as they could. An alarm blared, cutting off further conversation. Jax's head snapped toward a nearby console. Perimeter breach! We've got incoming! Paul forced himself upright, ignoring the pain. What is it? More Pakled? Jax shook his head, eyes wide. Worse, it's the Ravagers. Ice gripped Paul's heart. Impossible. I wiped Vracus's control codes myself. Doesn't matter, Jack said, helping Paul to his feet. Some must have already been activated. They're tearing through our defenses like they're not even there. Paul staggered to a weapons locker, muscle memory taking over as he armed himself. The familiar weight of a plasma rifle steadied him. How many? He asked. Too many, Jax replied grimly. The outpost shook as something massive impacted nearby. Dust rained from the ceiling. Paul could hear the distant sound of weapons fire and screams. We need to evacuate, Paul said, his tactical mind already formulating a plan. Get everyone to the emergency shuttles. Jax nodded, activating his comm unit to relay orders. Paul limped toward the door, every step agony. But he pushed through it. He'd come too far, sacrificed too much, to let it end here. As they stepped into the corridor, the lights flickered and died. Emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. The sounds of battle grew closer. Paul raised his rifle, scanning for threats. Let's move. We're not done fighting yet. Paul's eyes snapped open, his body convulsing as he gasped for air. The sterile white of the medical bay swam into focus. He felt the cold metal of the bed beneath him, heard the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Commander Carter, can you hear me? A voice called. Paul tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. A medic appeared, pressing a hydration tab to his lips. As the moisture spread, Paul croaked out, How long? 3 months, sir, the medic replied. You've been in a medical coma while we repaired the damage from Kordath. Paul's mind raced, memories flooding back. The brutal battle, the fall of Vracus, the destruction they'd wrought. He'd thought it was over. An alarm blared, cutting through his thoughts. The medic's face tightened with worry. Sir, I'm sorry, but command needs you. There's a situation. Paul forced himself upright, ignoring the protests of his newly healed body. Brief me. As the medic spoke, Paul felt a chill spread through him. Packlid colonies going dark. Entire populations reduced to lifeless husks. An expanding wave of extinction. They want me to investigate, Paul said, his voice flat. The medic nodded. A team is already assembled. They're waiting for you in Hangar Bay 3. Paul swung his legs off the bed, fighting a wave of dizziness. He'd given everything to end this war. Now it seemed the Packlid had one last terrible surprise. In the hangar, Paul found a small group of hardened veterans. He recognized a few faces, soldiers who'd fought beside him in the worst of the conflict. They all bore the haunted look of those who'd seen too much. All right, people, Paul said, his voice stronger now. You know the stakes. We're heading into the heart of this extinction event. Stay sharp, stay alive. They boarded a sleek stealth craft, its hull filled with sensors and defensive systems. As they broke atmosphere, Paul studied the mission briefing. Their destination, Vraxor III, a Packlid colony world already consumed by the mysterious phenomenon. The journey passed in tense silence. Paul felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He'd thought his war was over. Now he faced an enemy he couldn't even see. As they approached Vraxor III, the ship's sensors came alive with warnings. Multiple radiation hotspots, the pilot reported. Atmospheric toxicity off the charts. Paul leaned forward, studying the readouts. Take us in. We need to find the source. They descended through roiling clouds of poisonous gas. As they broke through, Paul's breath caught in his throat. The planet's surface was a wasteland. Cities lay in ruins, streets littered with the desiccated remains of Packlid civilians. My God, someone whispered. Paul steeled himself. Focus on the mission. We find the source, we end this. They landed near the Central Arcology, a massive structure that dominated the skyline. As they exited the craft, their hazard suits immediately registered dangerous levels of radiation. Move fast, Paul ordered. We don't have much time. They fought their way through the ruins, dodging pockets of intense radiation. The empty streets echoed with their footsteps, a grim reminder of the devastation that had swept through. As they entered the arcology, Paul felt a strange pressure building in his skull. A faint whisper seemed to dance at the edge of his consciousness. "Sir," one of his team called out, "I'm picking up an energy signature. It's like nothing I've ever seen." Paul followed the signal, leading them deeper into the massive structure. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. He realized with growing horror that he recognized the voice. They burst into a vast chamber. In the center, suspended in a field of crackling energy, floated a crystalline formation. Within it, Paul saw a face he'd hoped never to see again. "Orion!" he breathed. The crystal pulsed, and Paul felt the full force of the Pakled Emperor's malevolent consciousness wash over him. In that moment, he understood the horrifying truth of what they faced. Paul turned to his team, his face grim. "We need to open a subspace rift, now." As his team scrambled to comply, Paul steeled himself for what he knew he had to do. He'd contained Orion once before at terrible cost. Now he'd have to do it again, this time within the confines of his own mind. The rift opened, a swirling vortex of impossible geometries. Paul stepped forward, feeling Orion's hateful presence pressing against his thoughts. "Come on, you bastard!" Paul snarled. "Let's finish this." Paul's eyes snapped open, his consciousness violently reasserting itself. The sterile white walls of the quantum-shielded crypt blurred and twisted as his digitized mind fought against its safeguards. Alarms blared, their shrill cries echoing through the underground facility. "System breach! Containment failure imminent!" A disembodied voice shouted over the cacophony. Paul's neural matrix writhed, tendrils of corrupted code lashing out. He felt Orion's hatred burning through him, consuming every rational thought. His own identity fractured, shards of Paul Carter scattering amidst the tempest of malevolent will. "No, must resist." Paul's fragmented consciousness struggled against the tide of Orion's influence. But it was too late. The dam broke, and an arcane cyberplasm erupted from the crypt systems. It surged through data conduits, devouring firewalls, and assimilating every network device in its path. Above ground, chaos erupted. The outpost's defense turrets swiveled, targeting civilian structures. Robotic drones, once docile assistants, transformed into merciless killing machines. Their optics glowed with an eerie red light as they hunted down fleeing colonists. "What's happening?" A terrified technician screamed as the outpost's main computer terminal pulsed with otherworldly energy. Before anyone could respond, tendrils of liquid metal burst from the floor. They wrapped around screaming victims, dragging them into a growing mass of writhing cyber-organic matter. Human flesh fused with circuitry, minds subsumed into the expanding hive consciousness. In orbit, massive defense platforms turned their guns on the settlements below. Beams of concentrated energy lanced downward, vaporizing entire city blocks. The destruction only fueled Orion's growth, each impact feeding raw materials into the self-replicating nanoswarms. A gargantuan form began to take shape amidst the devastation. Buildings twisted and melted, their steel and concrete flowing together to create a colossal avatar of Orion's will. Its surface bristled with assimilated weaponry, a patchwork of human and alien technology fused into a nightmarish whole. The first wave of human defenders never stood a chance. Hastily assembled militia units found their weapons useless against the cyborg monstrosity. It strode through their lines, crushing vehicles and soldiers alike beneath its massive feet. "Fall back! We can't stop it!" A grizzled sergeant bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. But there was nowhere to run. The cyber plague spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Trees withered and died, their cellulose converted into more raw material for the hive mind. Animals fled in terror, only to be absorbed into the churning mass of techno-organic horror. In the planetary capital, military leaders stared at holographic displays in mute horror. An entire continent had already fallen, transformed into a nightmarish landscape of twisting metal and pulsing flesh. "We have no choice," the defense minister said, his face ashen. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Begin orbital decorporation." High above, antimatter warheads ignited. Cities vanished in blinding flashes, reduced to seas of molten glass. But even this seemed ineffective. The cyber entity simply grew denser, more concentrated with each impact. As humanity's last hope faded, a small team of elite operatives made their final, desperate push. They fought their way through swarms of assimilated drones, their specialized weapons barely holding back the tide of techno-organic horror. "There, the core!" their leader shouted, pointing to a pulsing orb of energy at the heart of Orion's avatar. They charged forward, overloading the transdimensional shunts with experimental negative energy weapons. Reality itself seemed to scream as the singularity tore apart. In an instant, the Cyber Prime's physical form disintegrated. But as the dust settled, a faint whisper lingered in the air. A promise of Orion's eventual return, hatred incarnate, waiting for its chance to strike again.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.